Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the fiscal cliff that this country faces on January 1st. We are now beyond the point, 4 weeks after the election, and now 4 weeks until the date of the fiscal cliff. And as Republicans have been pointing out on this floor, Mr. President, Congress must act soon to take on the numerous expiring tax provisions and the sequester. And I believe President Obama must provide leadership in those efforts. And I've seen very little so far. Last week I came to the floor to speak about the fiscal cliff and some of the concerns that I continue to have and hear about as I travel to Wyoming just about every weekend. I just got back from there a few days ago, and people are very concerned about the direction of the country and what may happen to all Americans on January 1st. Last week on the floor, I spoke about the President's proposal to raise taxes on people making more than $200,000 a year. In terms of spending next year, that tax increase would pay for just 6.8 days of what Washington will spend. So the whole proposal that the President continues to make is basically enough to fund the government for not 52 weeks, but 1 week alone. The tax increases that President Obama is now trying to push through will really do almost nothing to reduce our national deficit and nothing to reduce our national debt. The White House and Democrats in the Senate are focused only on tax hikes, while they continue ignoring the real drivers of our debt, which is the out-of-control entitlement programs of Social Security, of Medicare, and of Medicaid. Until we find a way to do meaningful entitlement reform, no amount of tax revenue will be able to match the increase in entitlement spending. Well, instead of leading the conversation, the President continues in his campaign mode, going around the country to try to sell his tax hikes. The President and the Democrats in Congress are willing to go over the fiscal cliff in order to get those tax hikes. Rather than negotiate in good faith, they're willing to try to spend their time trying to convince the American people that it's just someone else's fault. Going over the fiscal cliff will mean another recession, and this one squarely on the shoulders of President Obama. It will mean unemployment spiking back up over 9%. It will also mean a whole host of tax increases even beyond the higher tax rates that Washington Democrats want so badly. Americans are also facing big increases on the death tax and the alternative minimum tax, also known as the AMT. Both of these taxes will go up January 1st unless Democrats work with Republicans and take action to stop the increases that are already scheduled to occur. Now, there's bipartisan agreement that these taxes should not be raised. There is bipartisan agreement that these taxes will do great damage to middle-class families, to family businesses, and to family farms. Any effort to stop these harmful tax increases is being held up by the President's insistence on raising tax rates. Not just raising more revenue through tax reform and economic growth, but specifically raising tax rates. Now let's take a look at the death tax. Today, this tax, also known as the estate tax, is set up at a top rate of 35%, with an exception for the first $5.1 million of an estate's value. Well, those are the levels that Congress set and the President agreed to in 2010. It's a Republican House of Representatives, Democrat Senate, as well as the President, Democrat in the White House, 2010. Those levels are now set to jump dramatically to a top rate of 55%, with an exemption for just the first $1 million. Now, $1 million sounds like a lot of money until you start looking at a situation of family-owned businesses and family farms. Farmers and ranchers, for instance, have a lot of assets such as land, buildings, and livestock. Those things are worth a lot of money for purposes of calculating the value of someone's estate. But they're not liquid assets. You can't just spend a tractor. Well, once a mom or dad dies in the farm family, the IRS wants the death tax paid within 9 months. The tax is collected on though it's calculated on those big valuations for the farm or ranch property, has to be paid in cash. Often the only way, Mr. President, for the family to pay the tax is to start selling off parts of the farm. Families that have farmed for generations are forced to make life-changing decisions regarding their future, and they have to do it very quickly. Well, they may have to sell land or livestock at a time when prices are low because the tax bill is due immediately. If we don't act in Congress, this tax is going to hit more family farms, and it will hit them much harder, taking a much larger portion of the farm just to pay the taxes. And when you take a look at this chart, talked about crushed by the death tax in terms of the number of small businesses and the number of family farms that will be hit under the estate tax in 2012 as opposed to what's going to happen in 2013. Huge increase in 2013 as they find a different way to calculate the death tax, and the same with family farms. So the number of family farms that will be hit by this death tax will jump from just under 100, the current limits, to about 2,400 farms next year. It's an enormous increase, an enormous burden on those farm families. The same thing holds true of other small family businesses. The neighborhood restaurant, the grocery store on the corner, the local auto body shop. Again, these are small businesses that may have assets that are worth a lot, but that aren't easily turned into cash to pay off a tax bill. Now, I've said before that where I live in Casper, Wyoming, most of the businesses that we have are small businesses. The dry cleaner, the florist, the car wash. A lot of those small businesses are run by families, maybe have been in the family for a couple of generations, and they want to pass their business on down to the next generation. But when Washington comes looking to take its 55% cut, which is what's going to happen come January 1st, those businesses are going to be forced to sell off assets or maybe even just sell out entirely. When you look at the chart again, you'll see that under the limits we negotiated in 2010, just 200 small business estates are hurt by the death tax. Starting next year, it jumps to about 2,700 small businesses. Just like with family farms, we're not talking about big faceless corporations here. We're not talking about what happens when the founders of Walmart die. We're talking about what happens when the owner of a small family business dies. And those if these death tax increases go into effect, a lot of the sons and daughters are not going to be able to keep the family business that their parents worked so hard to build and to pass along. Democrats and Republicans agree this would be a terrible blow to a family farm or to a small family business. There's so much we talk about, Mr. President, about uncertainty, and just the uncertainty about what's going to happen next year under the death tax is very stressful for many families across the country who are running their own small businesses and their own small farms or ranches. At the very least, we should extend the current limits worked out in the 2010 compromise. President Obama should not be holding up that common sense solution just so that he can satisfy his left base agenda for unrealistically insisting on raising tax rates. The other tax increase that is set to hit American families very hard very soon is the alternative minimum tax. You recall, Mr. President, that AMT tax was created in 1969, and they did that when someone discovered that there were 155 people all across the country, only 155 people who actually had made a lot of money, but they didn't pay any taxes on it, and we know why. It was because of various tax loopholes. Well, Congress could have done something to close those loopholes, but instead, Congress created a whole separate tax scheme. Then, to make matters worse, it didn't index the income limits for inflation. So Congress comes along every year and acts a patch to keep the tax from hitting the middle class. Problem is, still done nothing to patch the AMT for this year. So I have another chart here about the millions of people who will owe the AMT come next April. 2011, 3 million people paid that AMT. Remember, it was designed because of 155 people who didn't pay taxes? and now you're going to have 31 million Americans who will be hit by a tax for the tax year 2012 if nothing is done to patch the problem. So if we don't do something soon, the AMT will hit an additional 28 million taxpayers this year for a total of $92 billion. That's the extra tax American families face when they file their 2012 taxes by April 15th of next year. These aren't the privileged few who are taking advantage of special loopholes that the tax was intended to catch. These are 28 million taxpayers who normally would never have to deal with the AMT. It's going to hit middle-class families in every state, more than 31 million taxpayers total across the country. Now, we can debate whether it was ever a good idea to enact the AMT a number of years ago, but we certainly should all agree that the AMT is about to hit a whole lot of people who should never have to worry about it in the first place. Those people are going to have to pay the IRS an average of $3,200 more in taxes. That's what the IRS is going to expect by April 15th. Most of these people have no idea that they're going to get caught in this AMT trap, and they have no idea how big a check they're going to have to write. These are middle-class, hard-working families who will get hit by additional taxes. Why? Well, because we can't take this simple step of patching the AMT like we always do. Again, there is bipartisan agreement that we need to enact this patch, but it's being held up as part of the fiscal cliff negotiations. The President has made his offer. He wants to increase taxes, add more stimulus spending, ignore the entitlement spending that is the true driver of our debt, and hold campaign-style rallies around the country to try to convince people it's not his fault if we go over the fiscal cliff. President Obama clearly enjoys campaigning, but Mr. President, the election is over. It's time for him to stop campaigning and to start leading. This means giving up his stubborn insistence on raising tax rates and instead focusing on raising revenue through tax reform and economic growth. It means doing something on these fundamental issues of tax policy that both sides agree on. That way, Mr. President, American families won't get hit with these massive tax increases. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.